In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Masked Masculine battles both Kensei and Rose's Bankai, Renji returns to the battlefield with a new divine power, and Hashwolf begins to unveil the mystery behind Yhwach. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Episode 18 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Rages at Ringside, is perhaps the first real test for the second core of the anime. Up until now, the second Quincy invasion has been trucking along, laying the building blocks for the major fights to come. Battles like Hitsugaya vs Basby and Soifon vs BG9 are great, but they're absolutely the appetizers. Now, while an argument could be made for Komamura vs Bambietta being one of the bigger battles from this part of the story, this episode, with Renji being a part of the main cast, his arrival undeniably introduces one of the first true tentpole fights of the core, and that's what this episode predominantly revolves around. So, how well does the episode stack up? How faithfully is Renji vs Masked Masculine adapted? And if there are changes, what does their impact look like on the fight as a whole? And crucially, how well does this fight turn out in the end? Let's crack on with our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, episode 18, Rages at Ringside. As always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the whole arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. Before we get started on the video, however, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to say a massive shout out and an enormous thank you to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. So, to begin with, as always, what's covered in this week's episode? Well, quite a few chapters again, but the amount of content doesn't feel quite so egregious when it's just following a fight. And in fact, there isn't a lot of movement this week, which is kind of refreshing. The episode sticks to the source material fairly faithfully, and chapters play out mostly in the order they should. And speaking of which, the chapters included this week are as follows. Chapter 560, Rages at Ringside, the episode's title, and a chapter that was also covered last week too. Chapter 561, The Villain, Chapter 562, The Villain 2, Chapter 563, Superstar Never Die, Chapter 564, Red Bristled Kings, and a small portion of Chapter 565, God Like You. And so, as you can probably see from that list, Masked Masculine is the star of the show this week, and that's kind of interesting. Before we dive into the spoiler analysis, I want to take the time to talk about Mask briefly as a character. Masked Masculine was, on the whole, I would say, fairly unpopular back in the day. His extreme, over-the-top and goofy nature, combined with the fact that he, pretty much without any real explanation, just destroyed countless characters in one huge battle that spanned over a month's worth of chapters, wore pretty thin on the community after a while. But here, the anime truly brought this character alive. I love his voice actor and the amount of gusto he brings to the role, and the same goes for Mask's #1 fan, James. The total weirdness of who is really magnified here by bringing him to life on the screen. Plus, this is an example of the anime's fast pacing working fairly well. Mask gets an episode dedicated to him and then he's out of the way. He doesn't get the chance to overstay his welcome and it works. But anyway, we'll talk plenty more about Mask moving forward, so let's begin the episode analysis. The episode opens with a rather interesting new scene. We're delivered an update on the status of the Soul Society's forces thanks to the intelligence of the 12th Division, which again is really nice to see, and the situation looks pretty dire. I have to say though, I like getting this information. It doesn't really add anything to the story as it's mostly acting as a recap of things we already know, but what it does do is it helps keep everything neat and tidy and stops the second invasion from feeling like it's spiraling out of control already with so many loose ends that people need to try and keep track of. By getting an update on where the defeated captains are, it helps keep viewers on top of everything going on. In the source material, we don't get an update of this kind until chapter 612, which is at the very end of the second invasion itself. This kind of recap only serves to reinforce as well that we are entering the next stage of the battle now and introducing the more important fights. The 12th Division has acquired a topographical map of the entire battlefield, and they reveal that only 42% of their forces are still alive, including the injured. So less than half of their force is alive, and within that 42% exists less than 30% of their total active military strength. Like I said, this is a pretty dire estimation, and I'm also not 100% sure it makes sense when you consider who is actually still around. I'm assuming this data is being skewed by a few things. The fact that characters like Zaraki, Byakuya, and Ukitake are missing obviously doesn't help, leaving Kyoraku, Mayuri, Kensei, and Rose as really the only captains currently capable of fighting still, as I'm assuming the Gotei 13's data isn't counting Kisuke either. When you put it like that, things definitely don't look good, and with the fall of both Kensei and Rose this week, Renji and Rukia's return to the war zone couldn't be more timely. That being said, things aren't exactly rosy for the Vandenreich either. They've lost 3 Sternritter in the last few fights, and Hashwolf estimated the battle to be fairly balanced the last time we saw him. Anyway, it's funny that Akon completely disregards Squad 11 as though he simply expects them to do their own thing. Up next though, something unexpected happens. The attention is turned squarely onto the low rank-and-file officers who are running around the battlefield without any leadership or direction. Kisuke is concerned that without anyone to lead them, their remaining officers will just be hunted down and picked off in enemy territory. So, Mayuri gets in touch with Kyoraku. They have a pretty interesting conversation, I think, where Mayuri really talks down to the new head captain in a way that both displays a true lack of respect and also feels a little bit uncalled for. Now, Mayuri isn't the most respectful person in the world, but there's no way he would have insulted Yamamoto in the same way he does to Kyoraku here. Sure, he might have stood up to him, even disagreed with him as we saw at the start of this arc, but I don't think he'd ever question Yamamoto's usefulness or capabilities to his face in a way that frankly comes across as just insulting. That being said, I do like that Kyoraku is being briefed on the situation as Commander-in-Chief. Also, Kyoraku's line, "just so you know the enemy was about to sip on my blood," is surprisingly intense. Mayuri then proceeds to patch Kyoraku through to all surviving officers in the field, and Kyoraku directs them to regroup at any nearby barracks they can reach. They're all sent the map that the 12th Division were able to put together so they can find their way through the unfamiliar terrain. Another detail I really enjoy. The fact that Vandenreich completely replaces Seirete with their own city is definitely glossed over a little bit too much in the source material, considering it is such a massive seismic shift, and I love seeing the Gotei 13 coming together to help even the lowest ranked soldiers find their way home. It makes sense, and again widens the scope, something I've advocated for many times in the past. I do wonder if this is going anywhere though, and if so, where? Nothing like this remotely happens in the source material, and I wonder if it's just an excuse to get the officers out of the way so the bigger fights can take place without worry. Kyoraku seems to have a broader plan, but even that is a bit confusing. Is this something he put together ahead of time with Mayuri? That seems unlikely since they didn't know the full scale of the Vandenreich's invasion plan, but it's possible they had a retreat planned for if things got really bad. I'll be keen to see what the team does with this plot thread, if anything at all, in the coming weeks. As the episode fires up again following the opening, I'm a little disappointed to see a totally reused scene from the end of last week's episode. I kind of get it, they ended episode 17 halfway through chapter 560, so perhaps it just makes sense to play that moment out again to make the transition smoother, but when there are cut scenes coming up, some considerably so, particularly from the battle between Renji and Mask, I'd probably rather they had kept those in and scrapped this recap scene instead. But as we then continue with chapter 560, Kensei then immediately activates Bankai, giving us our first look at Tekken Tachikaze since he was defeated off-screen unceremoniously in the Fate Karakura Town arc. The animation here is pretty nice and a harbinger of things to come. I love seeing the Bankai linked together as Kensei releases it in a flurry of Reiatsu. Mask then whips off his cloak and proclaims he'll defeat the captains in a 10 count before leaping towards Kensei with a huge, hefty kick. I will say there is some odd framing this week. I don't know if it's just because of Mask's enormous bulk, but many ordinary shots like this one just look far too zoomed in. Regardless, as Mask flies towards Kensei, we get a chapter-accurate episode title, which looks amazing. And the following showdown between Kensei and Mask plays out identically to the source material. Kensei blocks the first kick with ease, raging at how pathetic a vice captain Hisagi must be, before swinging round with his fist and slamming a punch into Mask's gut. Honestly, I really like how this all looks here in the anime. There's a nice fluidity to all of Kensei's movements, and the anger plastered on his face makes everything feel that bit more visceral. Unfortunately, due to the speed at which the action moves, we don't really get to see the warping effect of Kensei's punch on the environment around them. But as a crippled Mask collapses to his knees, Kensei lifts him in the air and details how his Shikai and Bankai both work. Kensei then ramming his fist into Mask's stomach again looks fantastic, with some wonderfully slick close-ups. The sheer force of Kensei's explosive Bankai works really well here too, before he sends Mask flying into a nearby building. What really stands out to me, though, is that when you get an uninterrupted section of action like that follows the source material almost perfectly, it truly does just fly by. 7 pages of action is covered here in about 60 seconds worth of episode. It's moments like that where you realise just how short some of these fight encounters actually were. But as Kensei muses that they're left looking like the bad guys after how badly he beat Mask up, with James sobbing over his champion's defeat, Hisagi wakes up just in time to reveal that they need to kill James first. Having seen this all play out now across the last few episodes, I'm actually in two minds about it. On the one hand, getting the extra fight was great, and I liked seeing Hisagi, Ikkaku, and Yumichika try and take Mask on, as well as the anime rather seamlessly linking that scene into this one. But on the other hand, though, this worked really well as a surprise reveal in the original chapter. When Kensei is shocked to learn the truth about James, so were we, and it worked really well. It's a situation where I think both outcomes actually work to a degree. But this next segment may actually be one of my favourite moments in the episode. James screams for the superstar to get to his feet, and again, the voice actor does a fantastic job here before Mask springs back to life. The effects are excellent. I love seeing Mask's face illuminated with a brilliant gold glow, his eyes gleaming as he leaps from the rubble, and everything is animated so smoothly. Kensei and Rose glancing back in shock as a rejuvenated Mask smacks Kensei across the face, sending him flying into a nearby building before punching Rose in the gut. Interestingly, Mask kicks Rose in the chapter, but I think this definitely packs more impact. As Mask introduces himself as S, the superstar, and receives his splash screen, we reach the end of chapter 560. I'm surprised they didn't include Mask's other line here where he says that the cheers of his fans are his power. Perhaps the anime team thought it was self-explanatory enough, but without it, his superstar Schrift is never technically explained. Also, I do miss James popping up on Mask's shoulder with a triumphant fist pump. Again though, as we move into chapter 561, the next action sequence is portrayed very faithfully. Kensei escapes the rubble before flying towards Mask, only to receive a seriously brutal beatdown. Mask lands a massive knee in Kensei's stomach before grappling with his head and slamming it with a powerful headbutt. Kensei attempts to retaliate, transforming his Bankai's gauntlet in a way that is never really explained to us, before trying to punch Mask once more. I was never sure what Kensei was doing here. Does changing the style of knuckle amplify the Bankai's effect somehow? Either way, Kensei looks to be overpowering Mask again until James cheers for the superstar, powering him up once more and allowing Mask to gain the upper hand. Mask breaks Kensei's arm before sending him flying into the ground. As I said, this all plays out just as it does in the original chapter, meaning Kensei's battle with Mask is recreated totally faithfully, which is cool, though I certainly wouldn't have minded seeing the Vizard get slightly better or at least slightly extended treatment, though that was probably always unlikely. So apologies to Kensei fans out there, but this does seem to be all he's getting. Watching Kensei grimacing on the ground as blood leaks out of his snapped arm is pretty rough, but Mask quickly puts him out of his misery by landing on him with a devastating finisher. A cool detail is that the link of Kensei's Bankai has been shattered, something I never noticed originally, but it is actually there in the chapter too. James is suddenly killed by Rose in a sneak attack before Rose activates his Bankai, Kinshara Butodan, a Bankai that is completely new to us, which is of course always amazing. As Kinshara unravels, there's a great new detail that shows the dancers being lifted up by strings like puppets. While the overall presentation of Rose's Bankai is kept mostly the same as in the original chapter, Rose himself gets a few new lines that change the general feel of this moment, which we'll get into in a bit. Firstly though, the visuals. Much like Dangai Joy before it, Kinshara Butodan is another CG Bankai. And just as an aside, it makes me wonder what else might be CG in the future. Mayuri's altered Bankai, Urahara's Bankai, maybe Pernida itself will be CG once its true form is revealed. However, I think Kinshara Butodan looks pretty good. I love the gleaming gold of the dancers, and they look suitably spooky here too. I like Rose, and this Bankai is further proof that Kinshara is an awesome and totally unique Zanpakuto. And I really enjoy the new little details here as well, such as a spotlight turning on the moment Rose says Bankai, and how the lighting of the show changes throughout. The dancers begin to swirl mesmerizingly around Mask, and the lights go out, plunging the show into a deep blue as a torrent of water is summoned thanks to the first dance of the Bankai, Sea Drift. Rose has a new line about Sea Drift itself, calling it a song of pain and dread, as Mask is crushed by the vortex of water. The anime also plays up Rose's darkly sadistic side too, something we only really saw for the first time in this chapter as he looks on at Mask suffering with glee. It's a tiny but great character moment for an underrated captain. The lights change again as Rose activates the second dance, Prometheus, incinerating Mask in flames controlled by the dancers. Mask can't believe what he's seeing, a Zanpakuto that controls both fire and water? Rose confirms that his power is indeed a deception, and there's a really cool shot of Rose's silhouette behind the wall of flame. I love the additional sequence too of Rose conducting the fires, using his conductor's wand to control the tempest as Mask burns. Rose gets a few new lines here once more about Prometheus before he explains to Mask that he controls music and the deceptive melody in Mask's ears will captivate his heart. As the lights go out completely on the show, Rose prepares to use his final technique, Ein Heldenleben, or a hero's life, when he realises Mask has placed his fingers in his ears. As Rose comments that won't save him, Mask removes his fingers, revealing they're covered in blood. As Rose looks on in horror, realising Mask has burst his own eardrums, Mask fires a massive yellow beam at the captain, punching a star-shaped hole through him in a flash. So, let's talk about this for a second. Rose's defeat in the source material became a legendary moment for many, perhaps the purest example of why anime characters shouldn't explain their powers to their opponents. It was seen by many as totally ridiculous that Rose goes to such lengths to detail how his power works, only for Mask to then predictably use that against him and wipe him out. It's often cited as one of the worst examples of an already bad and overused trope, a display of poor writing. Yes, we the audience need to understand how these powers work, but surely there's a better, more succinct way than having the hero spell it out for the villain and then lose immediately as a direct result. Interestingly, I don't think people would be complaining like this if Rose actually won this fight, but seeing as the Vizard never seemed to win any fights, this only exacerbated an already irritated fanbase. To be honest though, I think this scene comes across a lot better here in the anime, but also I've always defended Rose too. For starters, he had already killed James, so as far as he was aware, Mask wasn't going to be able to regenerate or grow any stronger. Secondly, I think it's fair to assume that Rose didn't expect Mask to forcibly break his own eardrums, as that is quite extreme. And again, something Mask only does because he knows James is still around to restore them. And finally, the anime in particular does a good job of showing that Rose has a flair for the dramatic. As his Bankai is unravelling, he's waxing lyrical to Mask about the effects of each dance and how Mask is doomed to play along with them. In the anime, it's easier to buy into the performative aspect of the Bankai, plus you get the sense that Mask is slowly working it out anyway. Really, the only line Rose said that maybe went too far was the deceptive melody that echoes in your ears, as that probably did help give the game away. But even then, Mask can hear this eerie jingle at all times that's only started up since the Bankai was activated, and his instinct would be to likely try and block it out. Considering Rose's Bankai is around for a meagre 4 pages in the original chapter, I like the small extension it got here, including seeing Rose being more active in the controlling of the Bankai as he conducts its actions. Anyway, as Mask blasts Rose with his Star Flash power, there's a cool detail that shows Rose's Bankai vanishing at the same time. I assume this is because in that split-second moment Rose has already been struck, and is in that instant so close to death that his Bankai involuntarily vanishes. Also, Mask's Star Flash unleashes in a fraction of a second. It makes more sense here how Rose was caught so off guard by it. But with a huge star-shaped hole in him, Rose collapses to the ground. Mask gloats, but realising Rose is still breathing, he fires another flash at him to finish him off for good. But as we reach the cliffhanger of chapter 561 and the halfway point of the episode, Renji arrives, deflecting the blast at the last second. This whole next sequence plays out the same as the chapter, with Rukia arriving to spirit Rose and Kensei away from the battlefield, allowing Renji to take Mask on alone. And so begins the first major battle of the core. As I said in my live reaction, it's a small shame that they removed the gag where Mask's mask pattern changes to fit his thoughts. In the original chapter, the star becomes a question mark when he realises he can't hear what Renji is saying, and then a light bulb when he remembers why. That being said, the star insignia is used in fun ways here in the anime too, a little bit later on. It is interesting actually how the anime seems to completely remove any reference to how Mask's power actually works. Here, Mask's line to James where he says he'd like some cheers and he'd like to be roused by his fans is totally removed as well. But James does cheer for Mask, and we see his mask filling up with light like a meter, one of the fun ways the star is used, before his eardrums are restored to their former glory. However, here is where we get our first major change in the episode, as the anime removes the entire first act of the battle between Renji and Mask. In the original chapter, Mask tells Renji to try saying something cool now, to which Renji simply says that Mask is a creepy guy. Hearing that insult, Mask launches into a rocket headbutt, slamming into the vice captain. However, Renji has simply moved aside and then jams the hilt of his Zanpakuto into Mask's back, cratering the Sternritter into the ground. As Mask begins to grow in rage, some of his facade beginning to slip, a star emblem appears on his fist, and he launches an enormous strike called the Star Murder Punch at Renji. Mask reveals that the star crest emblem makes his punch 10 times more powerful than before, but Renji has simply caught his fist in his hand. As Renji mocks the Sternritter, saying, "Can't you kill a Shinigami with a murder punch?" Mask begins to lose his mind, unleashing a thunderous torrent of punches at Renji. During this explosive barrage, however, James whimpers, and Mask realises that in the commotion, Renji has vanished and secretly butchered the fan. Renji acknowledges that killing James means Mask won't come back to life, and at this point, Mask calls Renji a coward, but as Renji retracts his Shikai, he grins, saying all villains are cowardly before slicing Mask across the stomach with a huge swing, ending chapter 562. In the anime, we cut out the entirety of that fight sequence, going straight instead to Renji killing James with an admittedly brutal decapitation and then slicing Mask from the cliffhanger. I'm of two minds about this change, to be totally honest, and as always there's some good and some bad to it. Firstly, I'm just surprised that they removed such a huge chunk of the battle, essentially an entire third, considering this is one of those milestone fights that helps to define the middle portion of this invasion. Secondly, I think removing it does affect the pacing of the battle to its detriment. Now there's no build-up in the fight whatsoever, there's no chance for us to get a lay of the land to see where each character stands. The fight just immediately goes from 0 to 100, which does make for a slightly weird watch. There's a bit of whiplash there. However, in defense of the anime, this fight also has its detractors in the source material too, with people believing Renji simply became stupidly powerful. Removing this first act actually does a lot, I think, for making Master Masculine look far more competent as an opponent, as he quickly overwhelms Renji with a barrage of powerful physical attacks after transforming once. Personally, I think it was a lot to cut out, and it does make the crescendo of the battle feel a bit artificial. I would have left in the very start of that fight sequence. Renji calls Mask creepy, so Mask tries to headbutt him, but Renji just slams his sword into Mask's back, as that is a cool Renji moment. As Mask gets to his feet, he sees that James has been killed, and he explodes in anger, preparing his fist, but Renji slices him across the stomach. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a bit annoying to lose these scenes when the episode replays a chunk of the previous episode at the start, but there you go. Before we move over to chapter 563, however, we have a new scene to look at. Rukia sails over the battlefield carrying Kensei and Rose. It's cool to see Rukia able to carry them both with such ease, and she discovers Isane's hiding place where the remains of the 4th Division are currently trying to treat the injured in a makeshift infirmary. A couple of points here. Firstly, it's nice to see Isane involved again. Secondly, the anime is sticking with having the 4th Division out here instead of where we find them in the source material, meaning presumably this is where Gremmy will find them too, unless the captains are moved to a different area. And thirdly, why haven't these guys regrouped with the other officers per Kyoraku's call? I assume it's because they can't carry the wounded, but it seems a bit weird nonetheless. Afterwards, we return to the start of chapter 563 as blood gushes from Mask's wound. The anime adds a very interesting little detail. Mask's mask begins to tear apart, which doesn't happen in the original chapter, and I thought they might actually show us his face. Renji even says that a hero of justice shouldn't hide his face like some masked thief, but Mask forces his body back together again. This scene is also slightly different here. In the source, Mask seems to be slowly losing his mind as he repeats that he won't die before shouting for James's assistance. In the anime, James just begins cheering for him, revealing his ability to survive seemingly endlessly. Interestingly, the anime seemingly makes the destruction of Mask's mask the reason for his next power-up, not the sheer amount of cheers coming from all of the James that have spawned collectively. I do love the new inclusion of Mask's mask being damaged like that, but I do kind of wonder what the point of it was if it doesn't really go anywhere, except I guess just to push Mask with enough anger to reach that next transformation. Now again, as he transforms, I love them playing What Can You See in Their Eyes here. It feels very nostalgic, and Mask's very physical, very muscular transformation is absolutely reminiscent of characters like Aion before him. Up next though, the anime cuts a page from the source material, and it's maybe the cut I'm actually the most sad to see gone. In the original chapter, after his transformation, Mask remembers who Renji is. He finally realises that this is the same guy he defeated back in the first invasion, and Renji confirms that he knew who Mask was all the time. So while ostensibly he's there to rescue Rose and Kensei, there's absolutely a personal side to this fight too, much like the ones that came before. This is another grudge match born out of the first invasion. It's a shame that this is totally gone here, as it removes that element from the fight completely. The next part of the fight actually plays out quite differently from the source material too. In both instances, Mask starts the fight with his Star Lariat ability, but the actual ability itself is changed between the versions. In the source, Mask seems to launch a massive projectile wave of energy at Renji, which sends him smashing through a building, but in the anime, Mask actually appears before Renji and whacks him across the face. We know it's a projectile attack in the source because Mask follows it up by saying he's able to take an enemy down from a mile away, thanks to his 1 mile arts, but that description is totally cut from the episode. Anyway, the next sequence is extremely cool in the anime as Mask charges Renji down, flinging him across the cityscape. Although it's moving very fast, pausing to look at individual shots shows Mask catching up to Renji and punching him hard at least a couple of times, sending Renji flying through numerous buildings. Although it is very quick, this is one element I do prefer here in the anime. I think the physicality of the movement suits Mask very well, and this is then followed up by a flurry of punches which we see in the chapter 2, as well as the aforementioned Star Murder Punch, which makes its appearance here, albeit not really in the same manner as the source. But yeah, I like that Mask is actually bearing down on Renji here though, his enormous size being used to great effect, making him look kind of terrifying as he just charges at Renji relentlessly. And like I said, the anime actually makes the fight seem a little more even than it did in the source material, giving Mask a decent amount of time to shine and really show off his strength. The implication to me in the source was always that Mask was attacking Renji from afar, but here he does seem to be physically up in his face. The shot of Renji trying to hold onto a wall before flying backwards is cut, which is odd because Mask's line about Renji not being able to hold onto a wall is actually left in. Mask then leaps into the air and activates his holy form, and as always I love the music just vanishing, replaced by the church bells ringing. The church bells being the theme of the Vollständig is honestly so perfect, and Mask's holy form looks genuinely really imposing, I think, with his blank white eyes and powerful, vibrant, dark crimson Reiatsu. Although his holy form is never named, I do like how unique it is, with his Quincy cross activating on his wrestler's belt and his wings taking the form of a cape, while his halo is just literally a massive star. Speaking of massive stars, Mask then summons a great star in the sky before activating his ultimate attack, Star Flash Supernova. Now again, I think this is depicted very differently here in the anime to how I thought it would look based on the source material. In the source material, a battered and beaten Renji is hanging presumably helplessly in midair, and Mask seemingly just imprints a massive explosive star onto the battlefield, annihilating everything in its wake. I always got the impression the star appeared instantly, but here in the anime it takes its time to slowly descend and reach the city, so I wonder if James had a chance to actually get out of the way. Plus, Renji is just nowhere to be seen here, so we have to assume that Mask can see him and is targeting him. Regardless though, the attack is impressive, and watching the explosions swallow up the confused James is really cool as well. But we then move to the first page of chapter 564, as Mask watches the enormous blast from up high as James is destroyed. Mask bellows that he and James are one as superstar and fan, and as long as he lives, James will return to life. I want to talk briefly about Mask's developmental arc here, because I think it's handled quite well. Master Masculine is supposed to be the ideal superhero personified. He fights for the little guy, his #1 fan, whose never-ending show of support keeps the idea of the hero alive, even if the hero is mortally wounded. But, despite not seeing himself as one, Mask is the villain in this story, and therefore he is a warped, bastardized version of what the hero can be. By turning his Star Flash supernova on James himself in his desperation to kill Renji, Mask has lost sight of who he's supposed to be and doomed himself at the same time. I like that the anime reinforces this by having Mask reassure James, but then adding in a new line where he quickly says, but more importantly, farewell villain, bidding farewell to Renji, showing how little he cares that he's just annihilated his fans. The new line here being simply more importantly, which I think was done to add emphasis to the fact that Mask doesn't really care about James in this moment. Mask only slips further into villainy as he comes closer to death, screaming and raging at Renji, telling him that justice and heroics don't mean anything anymore, and he's just going to kill him. It's a cool little arc for a character who's ultimately just a supporting villain. However, from the dust and flames, a giant snake skull appears. Is it Hihio Zabimaru, Renji's famous Bankai? Well, not quite. The source material made it clear that something about it was different, but I never really understood it, especially when you include the cliffhanger shot of Renji from the previous chapter showing the sword already protruding from the snake's mouth. Yet here he's lifting up the snake skull for some reason and moving the sword around. It's handled better in the anime, where we actually see the new Bankai build itself. The snake coils around Renji as the ape arm rests itself on his shoulder. Before we can see it in its glory, however, we flash back to Renji meeting Ichibei. Their conversation is almost the exact same as it appears in the source material, with Ichibei explaining he's the one who named everything in Soul Society. Interestingly though, Ichibei's line about knowing the name of every Zanpakuto from the moment it's forged by Oetsu is gone. But as Renji reveals Soo Zabimaru, I have to admit that it does look amazing here in the anime. The fiery, smoky atmosphere, the burning embers, it all does a lot for a design that I'm otherwise not that keen on, and it's the sort of power that only the anime can really bring. I love the shot from above of Mask looking down at Renji in Bankai 2. These are the sorts of showdowns we absolutely should have had more of in this arc. Perhaps best of all, however, is that Renji seems to have acquired a new theme song. One that's very reminiscent of Ichigo's own iconic track, Number 1, that's defined many a triumphant moment of victory for our hero, and now the same is happening for Renji as well, as he secures a much-deserved win. As Renji explains in a new piece of dialogue that it took a lot of hard work for him to finally hear that true name, Mask leaps into action. Their final clash plays out virtually identically to the source material, with Renji grabbing Mask in midair and breaking his arm before flinging him into a building. The moment Mask's arm is snapped, he loses his composure and his facade completely drops, with him rambling that he doesn't care about justice or evil anymore. The anime adds a comedic element to this scene, as if to humiliate the Sternritter a little more in his final moments, with Mask scrabbling to right himself in the air before flying towards Renji once more. I will say that the final clash looks spectacular. Renji transforms his blade and drives it through Mask's stomach before activating Soo Zabimaru's Zaga Teppo. By turning the blade like a key, Renji summons an enormous, boiling hot snake jaw which completely encompasses Mask, who's trapped on the end of Renji's weapon. As ferocious lightning bolts zap the air, the sense of power is palpable as Renji brings the beast's colossal jaws clamping down shut upon Mask in a violent, fiery explosion. And with that, Mask Demasculine is killed. His holy form fades away as his body is completely charred right down to the bone before it crumbles to dust. Watching his foe disappear, Renji asks if he burned himself out, before telling him that that's what he wanted, as he calls him Superstar one last time, ending chapter 564. It's a somber but decisive end to one of the larger-than-life Quincy personalities who revealed his true colours in his last moments. If Mask hadn't killed James, would the fight have gone differently? Honestly, probably not, as Renji was seemingly so far above Mask in Bankai, but it might have been interesting to watch it play out. However, relish this victory, because there really aren't that many traditional Shinigami defeating the enemy victories and killing them moments in this arc left to come. We have, of course, another post-credit scene to look at this week. It seems like we are going to get one every episode, I think, only this time it doesn't feature Ichigo. Instead, we find ourselves halfway through chapter 565, God Like You, which has been pretty thoroughly cut up and portioned out in a piecemeal fashion by this point. To be honest though, that does make sense to me. God Like You always felt weirdly out of place, like Kubo realised he needed to get some backstory for Yhwach in the midst of the constant battles somewhere. Here we see Yhwach resting on his throne as he realises James has died. A few people asked why I didn't mention that line in my reaction, and the simple truth is that Yhwach's line regarding James's death appears in the source material too. So let's talk about James briefly. It was revealed in one of Kubo's club outside answers that actually James was the true Sternritter, and Master Masculine was just his ideal hero brought to life, presumably through the power of the superstar. To be honest, I've always taken some issue with this. It just doesn't make much sense to me. If James was the real Sternritter, then how does he keep coming back to life? Why does he turn into a weird, alien-like, ever-multiplying gelatinous blob? If James is the holder of the Schrift, then why isn't Mask destroyed or erased the moment James dies? Surely it should be the other way around, that Mask is the holder of S, and James as his #1 fan is the personification of the superstar, which also explains why he can't really die. He's just an aspect of power, an idea brought to life, a part of Mask's ability. If James is the true Sternritter, then why does Mask introduce himself as such, and why does Mask seemingly have the Schrift? Why is Mask Masculine even at the meeting of the Sternritter? And how does Mask have a Volstendig if he's not really a Quincy? If it all comes down to Yhwach's line about James dying, I remember simply interpreting that to mean Yhwach realised that James had been killed completely, therefore Mask Masculine was well and truly finished and wasn't coming back. Does this mean that James, this really weird little old man, was the one to drink Yhwach's blood? Is James even a Quincy? It's all very strange to me. Anyway, it's not important. We see Mask's Reishi return to Yhwach literally, but in the anime something really weird then happens. Yhwach, in front of Uryu, dissolves into shadow before scuttling away, suddenly transforming into Hashwolf before his very eyes. Now I think what happened here is that in that moment Yhwach falls asleep, and there's clearly a system set up that sees Hashwolf transported to His Majesty's throne when Yhwach sleeps to enable Hashwolf to take on the role of ruler. I'll be honest, I do kind of prefer how this is presented in the source material. There's a sense of unease, paranoia, of tension in the air, and Kubo makes it seem like Uryu is planning on assassinating Yhwach in his sleep or something. Uryu approaches Yhwach's chambers with a determined look on his face, but is stopped in his tracks by Hashwolf, who questions him a couple of times on what exactly he's trying to do, and who clearly doesn't trust him, as he's openly hostile to Uryu. In the episode, Hashwolf does begin to explain the true nature of Yhwach before including a tantalizing new line where he asks Uryu if he knows what sort of being Yhwach is or not. Hashwolf comments that even Soken Ishida likely didn't know, which is fascinating, and I love that once again we're involving the wider Ishida family, before saying he can tell Uryu, as Uryu is Yhwach's successor, and the episode ends. So this is very exciting to me. I'm hoping next week we'll dive a little deeper into the mystery of Yhwach, and maybe even receive some revelations about him that we didn't get in the source material. But more on that in the predictions. Our poem for this week comes courtesy of Asnot, of course, as it's the same poem from volume 63, which reads, "There is no difference between living and being allowed to live, just as there is no difference between dying and being killed." It's a great poem and seems to reference Asnot's suspended existence between life and death when he found himself critically ill, only to be rescued by Yhwach. I'm really hopeful that Asnod's small piece of backstory won't be cut from the episode, but we'll have to see. Before we tackle our predictions for episode 19, The White Haze, it's time once again to return to the Sternritter in Memoriam section of the video, albeit with fewer new entries than I anticipated. This week we've lost the boisterous Sternritter S masked masculine and his #1 fan, James. Honestly, these characters, like I said earlier, were transformed for me in the anime, as they were for a lot of people, it seems. And I really enjoyed them. They're still not my favourite Sternritter by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought the anime did a fantastic job in really bringing them to life. However, we are really starting to lose some of the bigger, more impactful Quincy's now, and there's only going to be more to come in the following weeks. Speaking of which, some predictions for next week then. It's an episode I am very much looking forward to, definitely the one I am most excited for so far in this new core, the bulk of which will cover another major fight, Rukia versus Asnot. Asnot is one of my favourite Sternritter, and it's been a shame to see him not receive any new scenes in the second core whatsoever, so I'm hoping the anime delivers on his fight with Rukia, especially where his amazing holy form is concerned. And of course, the same goes for Rukia too. This is going to be a momentous week for her, as she not only reveals the true power of her Sode no Shirayuki, but of course, her long-awaited and stunningly beautiful Bankai. And again, I hope the anime is capable of capturing its majesty. I predicted many years ago that the anime would play the track Nightmare when Byakuya leaves Asnod's defeat in Rukia's hands, and I can't wait to see if it happens after so long. However, I don't think the episode will start with the fight. Instead, I think it's possible it'll start in one of two different ways. Either we'll see the continuation of Godlike You, or we'll get the start of chapter 566, What Is Your Fear? I'd be really interested in seeing them adapt that first scene of 566 featuring Renji and Nanana, because it's notorious for not going anywhere at all in the source material. The two characters pretty much never interact, despite that moment where it seems like Nanana has Renji dead to rights. So if they do adapt it, will there be a new sequence added in later where Nanana tries to take Renji out, or will they scrap Nanana completely from that moment and just focus on Renji? It's also possible, like I said, that they will start the episode with a continuation of Godlike You, but they may choose to make that chapter the post-credit scene once again. Also, regarding Godlike You, I know I've brought them up ad nauseum at this point, but where are Kangdu and BG9? They're not dead. Kubo hasn't drawn them a piece of memorial art, but they've way outlived their presence in the source material now. So here's what I think will happen. Next week, Hashwolf will proceed to tell Uryu the truth about Yhwach as per chapter 565. At the same time, though, he'll take Uryu to where Kang and BG9 are being held and execute them as a show of why that matters to Yhwach, basically showing Uryu to his face how the souls of the dead Quincy return to their king to bolster his strength. That makes a lot of sense to me and actually would nicely combine those two scenes, helping to make Kang and BG9's fates feel less random too. I think the episode will likely end 3/4 of the way through chapter 570, with Byakuya and Rukia leaving the site of the battle with Asnod, and the anime will keep Isane's scene for the week after, but I could be wrong. But that's it for episode 18, Rages at Ringside, and the first real test for the second core. So how did it do? On the whole, I thought it did pretty well. I actually was really impressed with how it adapted Rose and Kensei versus Mask, even if I wish the Vizards had been treated a little better, but of course that isn't the anime's fault. And when it came to Renji's big shining moment, well, again, I thought it was good, but it felt quite cut down, and that affected the overall pacing and cadence of the battle itself. On the flip side though, the fight was a visual and audio delight, with Renji's new Bankai benefiting especially from the anime's coat of paint. I also really enjoyed how visceral and weighty the battle felt, with Mask really leaning into his physicality to deliver some seriously hefty assaults. The animation was very smooth, to the point where you could tell special attention was given to the episode, and it gets me very excited for next week. So to summarise, it was still too quick, with almost the whole first act removed, but but everything else was fantastic. But that's what I thought of the episode, guys. Again, I really enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below, did you like episode 18, Rages at Ringside? How does it compare to the other episodes of this core? And crucially, what did you think of the big fights on show this week? Renji versus Mask, and Rose and Kensei versus Mask as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, as well as how the new Bankai saw Zabimaru and Kinshara Butodan were both portrayed. But until next time, guys, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give it a thumbs up. And until then, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.